So, looking back, should I have been worried about this game? I think my worries at the time were valid, but now that we have the game in our hands, no, not at all. The game's really fun and extremely well made. I urge anyone interested in getting the game to please pick it up. It's very fun from a casual point of view, with nice accessibility options for new players and a really good amount of competitive depth, which I'm excited to explore over the next few weeks.
This was the closing statement that I made when I originally talked about the release of DNF Duel back on the 8th of July 2022. After that review released, I was optimistic about the game's future and how far it would go. The game is fun, has amazing netcode, and most importantly, functioning lobbies. So why at the time of writing have I put less than a full day of playtime into the game if I enjoyed it so much? Well, there's many things, so let's get into them. Let's talk about DNF Duel's wasted potential. DNF Duel was released on the 28th of June 2022 on the PC, PlayStation 4, and PlayStation 5. The game was met with very mixed reviews from players, however competitive folk of the FGC seemed to really enjoy the game, and a niche community formed around it. The keyword being niche. Competitive fighting games are already somewhat of a niche hobby, however within the FGC itself there are generally some games that are seen as big games that attract the majority of players. And then there's some smaller games that people still play, but they generally don't have as big as a draw as other games. A lot of the time these games end up being side tournaments at the back of the venue without dedicating viewing spaces or large crowd. There's nothing wrong with playing niche fighting games, in fact sometimes they can be more fun just because of how tight-knit the community is. However, DNF Duel had the audience of a niche fighting game, yet just had a tournament with a prize pool of $100,000, with first place taking home $50,000. This was the conclusion of the Arc World Tour, a tournament series in which the top placing players in several different majors were invited to compete to see who was the best player of DNF Duel there is. This ran alongside a Guilty Gear Strive tournament with the same prize pool, and that game is doing much better than DNF Duel is. So if there's so much money on the line and Arxis is pushing the game alongside its flagship title, why are there so few players? What's going on here? Well, there's multiple reasons that people point to when they say that DNF Duel failed the way that it did, and I want to look at some of them and walk you through how they affected the game in the long run and answer the all-important question: will DNF Duel make a comeback? So let's start with the big shock at the time, the fact that it wasn't on the EVO lineup. The main EVO lineup for 2022 was announced early in March of that year. These games were Street Fighter V, Mortal Kombat 11, Tekken 7, Guilty Gear Strive, King of Fighters 15, Melting Blood Type Lumina, Dragon Ball FighterZ, Grand Blue Fantasy Versus, and Skullgirls. Now, at the time, the FGC did have a large amount of hype for DNF Duel. I remember it, I was there. So DNF Duel not being at the EVO lineup was a bit of a bummer. Imagine a major tournament for the game happening just over a month after the game came out. It would have been absolute chaos. Though it does make sense, having just a month to figure out a game and become competitive, it would lead to some interesting matches for the game's first major, so maybe the game was left off of the main game roster because of that. I mean, they wouldn't want that game to be on the world stage of fighting games and look like an absolute chaotic mess, would they?
That is, of course, brilliant news. I know everyone's hyped behind their screens right now, smiling, but we've got to get into the game announcements, and we're going to let you guys know that making its debut at EVO 2023 is Street Fighter VI.
Granted, Street Fighter VI will have more time than DNF Duel between when it is released and when it will be on the main stage. However, looking back at the EVO 2022 lineup, yeah, nah, there was no room for it to fit, but the time between the release isn't the cause of it not being there. A lot of people say that EVO not having DNF Duel on the main game roster was a big blow to DNF's life cycle, because people didn't want to focus on it because they won't get to play it at EVO. But many fighting games have managed to still thrive without EVO being there to back them up. Undenied Inbirth managed to do so well in its scene that it was actually added to the EVO list after the community grew large enough to be recognized, and now French-bred games are always a staple of the EVO lineup. So this wasn't exactly the deathbed of the game. DNF could have had a long and prosperous life and made it onto next year's EVO lineup, replacing something. But it didn't. So something's obviously gone wrong here. So what did go wrong? Well, if you remember at the start of the game, a lot of people were saying that the balance and character power of the game was absolutely insane, with characters like Hitman and Switmaster just absolutely styling on everyone. The community would cry out for some sort of update to the game to help fix these problem characters, and there were certainly some updates, so let's see how they fared. DNF Duel has done what many people have thought to be completely impossible, as it is a recently released AAA fighting game that somehow manages to have barely any balance changes during its entire lifespan. The game was released on the 28th of June 2022 in a pretty decent state. If I remember correctly, there were no major bugs found at launch. There was some problems with the game recognizing keyboard controls on PC, but apart from that, nothing major was really going on. In fact, the game was not touched for nearly an entire month until the 21st of July came around, and there was a small balance update to the game. And by small, I mean very small. There were 4 things that were changed for characters. 2 of them were actual balance changes, and the other 2 were simply bug fixes. For some players, this was excusable. The game was still being figured out, and players were still finding tech, so it didn't matter too much that the updates were not coming immediately. But there was a group of players that just didn't like the way that the game was, and wanted things to be changed and fixed in certain ways. Either way, this didn't make all players happy, but it never was going to. Slowly, very powerful characters began to reveal themselves, and players wanted the game to be patched as the strong characters were way stronger than the weaker characters. The developers then patched the game a month later, on the 29th of August 2022, in order to address the growing concerns of the community with the balance around the game. And the patch gave Swiftmaster a slap on the wrist and basically did nothing else. After 2 whole months, the game was barely touched, and the player base was not exactly happy about that. For old games in the FGC, this was pretty common. You could go an entire year or even multiple years without the game being touched or updated. If you didn't get a tile update, you were stuck with the version of the game that you had. Is that character broken? Well, I guess you're fucked. They're gonna stay broken. However, nowadays, when fighting games release, it's generally common for developers to update the game semi-regularly for several years, while players are still playing and competing, be it through DLC characters or actual balance patches. Sticking with just Arc System work games, even though Arxis isn't the one developing the game, they're just helping it out, it's kinda weird. Guilty Gear Strive released on the 11th of June, 2021. The first DLC character was released on the 27th of July 2021, and the first major balance patch was on the 26th of August 2021 alongside a new DLC character. Then an even bigger patch that changed everything came in October of that year. DNF Duel had something that could barely even be classed as a patch a month after release, and then another minor patch another month later, and then it wasn't touched for 4 whole months. Until the game finally got its first major update with changes to every character. During all of this time, the devs barely communicated, so we had no idea what was happening. They told us that there was going to be a patch at some point, and most characters were going to get buffed, but apart from that, we didn't know much. In fact, we only just got a full trailer for the first DLC character and news of the Battle Pass, and we won't be getting her until summer of this year. Yeah, she looks really cool, but there's no one around to play her. And you're saying that we have to wait at least 3 months until she's released to the public to play? I'm not saying that every fighting game needs DLC planned out of the gate in order to be successful. However, this is a major fighting game developed by one of the biggest fighting game developers in the scene, and the people who made fucking Marvel vs. Capcom 3, with the game being published by the creators of Dungeon Fighter Online. There is money going into this game, so why didn't it have DLC planned from the start? And also, where's the fucking content? For anyone who's been around on my channel for a while now, you've probably known that recently I've been diving more and more into the single-player sides of fighting games and looking at what these games have to offer players that aren't just good online experiences. In my previous video on this game, I skimmed over the single-player modes. I didn't see them as very impactful. At the time, I would spend most of my time simply playing fighting games online with friends in big groups where we could switch between who's on the cabinets. However, after my friends left to go play other games and the ranked and casual queues died, because people stopped playing the game altogether, I was left with very few options on how to play the game, with the single player experiences being some of the only options I have. And the single player options are very lackluster. The story mode is barely passable, being your standard set of fights interrupted by graphic novel cutscenes of your character interacting with another character before beating the shit out of them. It does confirm that Dragon Knight is fucking unhinged though. This is pretty common for fighting games nowadays, but it's just not that good, it's not that interesting, and it's not that engaging. And the fact that these characters are named after classes in Dungeon Fighter Online, they don't really have any character that people are already gripping onto. Arcade mode is what it says on the tin. It's an arcade mode in which you fight several characters in a row in order to try and get as far as you can. I played on the hardest difficulty and I thought it was bullshit until I got past Crusader and just remembered that he was fucking insane. And then it became a pretty standard arcade mode. Nothing to write home about, it's fine, but there's nothing out of the ordinary. The fact you can choose the difficulty is nice, but it's really not that crazy. Survival mode is again similar to the survival modes of other fighting games, however it does have one nice little twist. You can actually spend points on upgrades for your character, so you can make them do more damage, take less damage, regen mana quicker, have more mana, and even some little bonuses to increase your score or make the fights easier. It's honestly a really cool mode and I enjoyed it a lot. Even though I did play on the shortest version possible, I could see how going for the 100 straight wins while managing your stats and points could be a lot of fun. A great mode, but unfortunately not enough to carry the whole game. And that's it for the single player modes. Everything after that is just achievement hunting in the forms of the titles, and most of them have to do with the online rank queue, which isn't exactly alive right now. It's a damn shame how the game turned out, but with the lack of any defined single player mode and the lackluster online scene right now, it's honestly not surprising. So, looking forward, what's in store for DNF Duel? Well, the developers have finally announced a season of DLC characters for us to look forward to, alongside a new balance patch that once again will buff the characters and change some of the systems. And while Spectre does look really cool, and the hope that they're going to keep the game alive with more DLC is there, I'm worried that at this point, the game is already too far gone. DNF Duel failed to capture even a fraction of the DFO player base, with the peak Steam player numbers coming nowhere near the level of what DFO has in subscriber counts. The FGC definitely had their fun with the game when it came out, but the community that clung to it for a while wasn't as big as it could have been. And now that the game is finally getting updates, it has actual competition to go up against in order to get players' attention. Street Fighter 6 comes out in early June, before the DLC character is slated to release. It's not looking good, but hopefully there will be a small, tight-knit community around the game keeping it alive. Fighting games never truly die, and DNF will still have people playing it. However, if you are hoping for another big fighting game that has many years of developer support and constant content, you better hope that DLC does really well, because it's looking like DNF is going to stay a Discord fighting game for the rest of its life. What a damn shame.
As always, a very special thanks to 64MHz, Almost Nap Time, Brudikai, Daniel Wiedericht, Dragonprox, Games.png, I Am Naoto, Lady Dancelin, Melodically Me, Monact, Nhoa, Ray W, Super, Tom Tanks, William Gannon, and Zandatsu for being Tier 2 patron supporters.